studies, and he is heading the direction of scientific research at the direction of scientific research of the Ministry of the Wallonia Brussels Federation, representing Belgium at different committees and work groups of the European research area. So, Marc, it's your time to speak.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me and talking, and I hope entertaining you before the lunchtime about a topic which is really dear to my heart for the work I'm doing at the ministry, but also at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. We will talk about the open science policies within the so-called European research area. As you know, European research area, it's more than the 28 member states, still 28, but it includes also the 13 associated countries like Norway, Israel, or Switzerland. So we will tackle this level of policy making, the European research area, policy making in open science. And on the one hand, what I would like to do with you is to consider if or to what extent those open science policies are in the continuation of already existing European policies that support the opening of research towards more researchers, towards non-academic stakeholders. And on the other hand, I would also consider if these open science policies fit with the way research and open research is managed within the European research area. And as you can imply from my title, although there are a lot of very, very stimulating initiatives, and some of them were mentioned by Jean-Claude this morning, there are still some, obstacles or even contradiction or ambivalences. So this is really what I would like to discuss with you now. I will very briefly, because it has been very brilliantly explained by other speakers this morning, repeat things a little bit in perspective. We all agree that open science mainly proceeds from this digitalization of science, which is one of the most important tendency in science, and not only in science production, but also in science dissemination and publication, together with what I call exoterization. Exoterization, it's by opposition with esoterization. Exoterization, that's this movement to open research. On the one hand, towards broader networks of researchers, interdisciplinary networks of researchers, and on the other hand, also towards industry, NGOs, citizens, non-academic stakeholders. Of course, there are a lot of other tendencies and trends in research and research dissemination which impact and are impacted by the open science movement. Internationalization of science, massification of science, big science, of course, managerialization of science, the use of new public management in science management, the way we use publications as performance indicators, the way impact factor has become, as Jean-Claude told us this morning, the real currency in this research labor market, and also in the rankings of universities and the benchmarks of national systems, which leads me to the last trend, the marketization of higher education, research, production, and dissemination. Of course, open science itself is a very broad topic, but I really like this umbrella, which I didn't invent. It comes from the librarian Robin Champiot. We have here the main dimension of open science. Of course, open access to publication, open research data, citizen science, science done for and with citizens, open education, diversity, and open source. Those are really the main dimensions that we may find under the umbrella of open science. In a nutshell, what are the open science policies until now in the European research area? I think a first important step was a little bit more than 10 years ago in the communication from the Commission. As you know, the Commission has no legislative power in research, so it's mainly, through communications, recommendations that the policy making is explicitly done. And we had in 2007 a communication about the role of scientific information in the context of digitalization. And it was really clear that the Commission considered ICT developments as the best way to open scientific information. Then, and we tackled this also in the morning, the mandates in the 7th framework program and the Horizon 2020 program, which is the 8th framework program for research and innovation within the European research area. Now, open access is mandated, but also open research data. There's currently a pilot in Horizon 2020 mandating that researchers who are funded by Horizon 2020 deposit their data too in open access. In 2012, we had another very important communication from the Commission about the European research area itself, which fixed 5 big priorities. And it's really interesting to read that the 5th priority, which is about the circulation of knowledge, really is about open access and open science. So this was very clear that open science becomes the 5th priority of the European research area in 2012. At the very same moment, in July 2012, we had the so-called scientific information package from the Commission with a recommendation and a communication on open access. 2 years later, things broaden a little bit, and what the Commission used to call Science 2.0 becomes European open science, aggregating all those dimensions which were under the umbrella in my previous slide. According to the Council of the European Union, 2 years ago, open access has to become the default principle for next year, basically. And last year, latest very important project relating to open research data, the European Open Science Cloud, which intends to make the different data repositories in Europe interoperable. Okay, and now let's consider those open science policies in the perspective of, I'm really sorry, this is not the latest version, but it's not a problem. In this perspective of opening research, in the perspective of this exoterization movement of research within the European research area. This is not something which is waiting the open science in Europe to be done. In the 80s, within Europe, there were a lot of talks about strategic research. And then 10 years later, in the 90s, there was a very buzz concept, a buzzword, this notion of mode 2 of knowledge production, which means producing knowledge together with researchers and external stakeholders to try to bring solutions to societal challenge and working in an interdisciplinary way with different types of stakeholders. And this was evilly promoted in the 19th in the European research area, not only because, but also because some of the inventors of the notion, like Helga Novotny, for example, they had important roles in the European research area. She was, for example, president of the European Research Council. So those programmatic ideas really disseminated to the European research area in the 90s. And the very definition of the European research area is conformed to that. It's an area in which researchers' knowledge and technology is supposed to freely circulate. An interesting evolution from the 7th framework program to the Horizon 2020 8th program, science in society has become science with and for society, which is really in this direction too. And in Horizon 2020, we have societal challenges, which is absolutely conformed to this mode 2 of knowledge production ID or programmatic ID. And I can tell you that in the next 9th framework program, this notion of challenge and missions will be even more important. Also the notion of responsible research and innovation, which is another way to basically promote the same concepts. So looking now at the open science policy in the European research area, it's very clear that they are really in line with this exoterization movement. If we look at the text of one of those 2 documents from the scientific information package of 2012, the communication towards better access to scientific information from the Commission, what we can read is that the Commission sets out measures to ensure that the results of Europe's publicly funded research are fully accessible for researchers, business, and citizens. Also, scientific information should benefit universities, funding bodies, libraries, innovative enterprises, governments, policymakers, NGOs, and society at large. Improved access to scientific information will lead to more science-literate citizens capable of thriving in the complexities of the 21st century. So the political discourse was quite clear that open science is supposed to go beyond broadening the networks of researchers, but also engaging, external stakeholders in the research process. That's the same for 2 years ago, this book by Commissioner Moedas and his team about the 3 O's, open science, open innovation, open to the world. The same idea that, open science has to be a social and economic driver and has to engage citizens also. And this is recognized by the Council in 2016 altogether. Okay, so this is quite crystal clear. The European research area is really in favor of opening science to a very broad set of stakeholders. Now, please let's consider, and sorry for flashbacking in the slides, let's consider open science policies in the context of the managerialization tendencies. Let's consider to what extent those open science policies fit or do not fit with the current way research and open research is managed within the European research area. And there things are a little bit more, ambivalent, I would say. Of course, because the Commission doesn't have any legislative power, new public management rules and more particularly open method of coordination is very important, which means that performance indicators are also really important. And if you look at the different currently used, I try to really take all the currently used indicators that relate to science production, academic science production and publication. It's quite clear that it's mostly based on those databases we were discussing earlier this morning, the Web of Science, like Clarivate Analytics, but coming from Mr. Garfield's efforts, and also Scopus by the major publisher Elsevier. I won't go into all the details, but for example, the European Innovation Scoreboard, which is a really important benchmark exercise in the European research area, you have 3 important indicators and a very important composite indicator which are based on publication and citations. If you look at the so-called European Research Area Progress Report, 5 indicators out of the 24 are based on bibliometrics, publication and citations, including, how could I say, something which is wrongly, I think, but considered in the policy-making circles, the gold indicators for research excellence, the so-called adjusted and readjusted every 2 years research excellence indicators, which is a very important indicator, which is based on citations from the Web of Science. Let's look at the EU multi-rank, the alternative ranking financed by the Commission. It's really multidimensional. I think it's quite better than the usual international rankings, but nevertheless, for research, it's still almost exclusively based on the Web of Science. Let's look at the monitoring of open science. Same thing. It's the Web of Science, which is 95% in use for monitoring open science within the European research area. And in the EU multi-rank, we do not have any indicator relating to open science, which is a little bit weird. So, having said that, what's the contradiction? I think you feel it, of course, intuitively. But I like to refer to, there are not a lot of laws in social science. From an epistemological point of view, I think we even may say that there's no laws in social science. But there's something, at least, which has been, theoretized from different points of view, and this is that the indicators, the performance indicators, usually they do not only measure the reality, but they have a very strong impact on the reality they are measuring in the best case, or pretending to measure in the worst case. This has been done, in the field of social policies evaluation. This is the so-called Campbell's law. This has been done monetary economics. This is the so-called Goodhart's law. This has been done in the sociology of science. This is the famous Bruno Latour mesure, mesurant, a measuring measure. You measure, but you have an impact of what you are measuring while you are doing the measure. So it's really from different fields of social science that this law has been asserted. So, I think we do not take big risk by asserting that also in our case, new public management indicators and benchmarks may function as managerial prescription on research production, research dissemination, and of course research evaluation. This means that there's clearly one prescribed type of publication. It's publishing as many as possible articles in the English language. Jean-Claude also emphasized that this morning in international highly cited journals, preferably published by major publishers. And it's not only an idea, it has been empirically showed by different bibliometricians that, you know, there's an overrepresentation of English in this database, the Web of Science corpus, that more than half of the journals which are indexed in those databases are published by the 4 or 5 major publishers of this world. This is even 70% in the case of social science, which is quite, you know, striking, I think. If we have some prescribed types of publication, this also means that we have some less prescribed, or even unprescribed types of publication. What are these types of publication which are not that prescribed on the managerial level? But of course, this is a publication of negative results. I won't say that nobody cares about them, but they are not in the, you know, the management system. The publication about more local systems, local situations, vernacular languages, non-English languages, publication which may be relevant to some other areas than the global north we were referring to in the geopolitics of knowledge production. Think about the SSH, the importance of books, the importance of scholarly essays, hybrid, but not in the, you know, in the economic meaning of the terms, but hybrid publication, which are based on research, but which are targeting broader audience, and all other types of popularization work. This is not prescribed at all by the current management rules. Same for critical edition of literary works, exhibition catalogs, research reports, grey literatures, blog articles. All those kinds of outputs we can have through citizen projects. This is not tackled, this is not taken into account, or at least not enough, and not to say a word about open educational material. Mm-hmm. So this is quite clear in a nutshell, in a few words. There's clearly, perhaps not a contradiction, but at least some ambivalences. Since there's no managerial incentives within the era to produce and to disseminate openly, of course, a lot of outputs, particularly in the SSH, other than international articles, and to produce, publish, and assess these outputs that are based on research, on serious research, but that target broader audiences of stakeholders. So this is really, in my opinion, the contradiction we are facing. And Jean-Claude was referring to Narcisse this morning, and so I would like to keep the good mythological company, not with Narcisse anymore, but with the Roman god Janus, you know, this guy with 2 faces. And I think this is really our man for open science dilemma, since Janus is the god of passages and openness, but also the god of closed doors. When there were wars in the Roman times, they closed the doors, and Janus didn't look in the direction of the enemy. This is also the god of choices, and I really think we are facing some choices now, so this is our man. I resumed a lot of the things in my last slides, the 2 phases of European open science policies. Perhaps there are more than 2 phases, but, you know, I think we can have a simplified idea by proposing those 2 options, and this is a little bit what Mr. Thorney this morning also said, I think, in his reaction. Firstly, there's an option which is just, you know, changing by continuing. Publish or perish, or even more, publish here or perish anywhere else. That's one of the options. There will be change in this option, but there will be mainly changes in the business model. We will pay APCs rather than subscriptions to major publishers, perhaps some predatory ones, although we have to be cautious about this notion. We will have offsets, we will have flipping, we will have big deals to zero with major publishers. That's perhaps very nice, but we will also of course, strengthen this impact factor culture. We will strengthen this currency of the impact factor with all the bad sides of it, including the risk for the biodiversity, particularly in the SSH, but not only in the social science and the humanities. Of course, we will have some exoterization, we will have some opening towards researchers, which is of course very important, but not so much towards other types of external stakeholders. The industry will be happy because, you know, they will receive all the publication in the coming from the major publishers. The difference will be that as they are not often authors, it will be totally free for them. No subscription anymore, everything paid by the public services, and they don't pay the APC and they receive, you know, the knowledge. So for them, perhaps it's quite nice solution, but for the other stakeholders, citizens, NGOs, whatever, this is not so nice. And of course, in this scenario, citizen science will remain the poorest parent of the EU open science policy. I'm currently co-chairing the European Research Area group on open science and innovation, and it's quite clear, analyzing the policies of the different member states and associated countries, that citizen science is really the poorest parent in the open science policies in Europe, and I think in the world in general. The other option, and I'm not saying it's the best one, but it's another option. It's really, you know, engaging in open science, but open science as a new paradigm, it's something really and profoundly different. First, by using metrics in a responsible way, and I would say in an open science friendly way. And there are currently efforts done, including at the European Research Area level. I don't know if you know this document, but it's quite interesting, although I'm not absolutely fascinated by all the indicators, but one of the high-level group has produced the so-called open science matrix, and it tries dimension by dimension of open science to propose possible, potential indicators, qualitative and quantitative ones, to take more into account the broad notion of open science, not only, you know, the number of publication and citation in the usual international databases. Of course, it's important to publish, but there's a difference between gold publishing with incredible APCs and what I would call fair gold publisher. That's something which is also on the market. And we should also try to develop alternative publishing manners. And I really believe also, like Jean-Claude Guédon said this morning, in these platforms. And it's very good that also Europe is, you know, engaging a little bit step by step, but nevertheless engaging in this direction. Platforms of preprints with modules of open peer reviewing. Everything is possible. You know, there are a lot of ways to crystallize around these platforms. This doesn't mean that articles would not be anymore an important piece of the puzzle. Of course, they remain very, very important. This is still the building blocks of the system. But I believe the system has to be considered more like an ecosystem, a broader science communication ecosystem. So we have somehow to open the open science, I think. And finally, I really believe, perhaps because I'm a Belgian, and in Belgium, the policy in open access has strongly supported the green road, but I'm persuaded that green is not enough. You have to have some complementarity with the green, the gold, the platforms, whatever. All the colors of the rainbow are nice, but they have to be complementary. But nevertheless, in Belgium, we like the idea of putting things and all sorts of things in institutional repositories. And this makes possible to give visibility, accessibility, and it makes also possible to assess potentially a broader diversity of research outputs, a broader diversity of types of publications, and to make them accessible not only for researchers, that's of course the basic of the basics and the most important, but also to industry and to citizens alike. So this is really another option. There are more than two options, but I think, you know, it's a good way to stimulate the debate about European Research Area policy making in open science. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marc. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Michael. So we have a few minutes for questions. So if you want to ask Marc, Michael, or Elizabeth A question about their presentations. Yes, Dana?
Well, I don't know if the presentations are mentioned, but we know that the beginning of the open access movement, we have the resistance, a lot of resistance of the authors. And after the 10 years of the movement, I'd like to hear, the point of view of yours about this, if it is still the resistance of the authors and the context of the open access, the data, and the open data, the open notebooks, research notebooks, and I see that we have a new wave of resistance. It's the opinion of yours. I don't know.
So Diana, it's about the resistance of authors to open access and also new kinds of publications and how they can be taken into account in the assessment.
There is still resistance of the authors after the 10 years of the movement.
That was one of the question for also I had for Elizabeth to know at your university, at Loughborough University, how academics to react or is there any training or how academics are convinced that they have to publish their works and how do they react to the mandate? I don't know whether Loughborough University has a mandate for open access publishing.
Yes, we do. Most universities in the UK do have an open access mandate because because funders mandate us, we mandate our staff, and they will comply. And academics will comply if they're told to. And I think with certainly younger researchers are happier to comply than perhaps more established academics for whom this is quite new. But I think there's three things. There's two Don Claude mentioned this morning. The researchers need to be convinced on the grounds of it's better for them to find information, it's better for them in terms of prestige, but also I think they need to be convinced in terms of it's better for them as a copyright owner. And I don't think they're being convinced on any three of those fronts at the moment. Perhaps information seekers, more is available on open access now. But certainly in terms of prestige, we have no metrics. All our metrics are citation metrics. We need metrics for open science and open access, which is what Mark was talking about. But we also need to engage, I think, with our researchers around copyright ownership. I mean, a lot of the new innovations around open access, for example, CC BY licenses required by gold open access policies, give end users more rights than copyright law would allow. And a lot of academics, particularly in arts and humanities, are up in arms around this because it impinges on their moral rights, their right to object to the derogatory treatment of their work. All they have left is attribution. And so I think academics do have this strong sense of ownership of intellectual property, which we, as institutions, I think we're best placed to help support them in developing an open access world that meets their needs and isn't just dictated to by funder policies or publisher policies, if that answers your question.
Yeah. Oops, sorry. If I may add something to that, I have a case study from French-speaking Belgium about this chain of mentality of researchers. Basically, one of the first universities, or the first university in French-speaking Belgium, was the Université de Liège, which with a very strong open access mandate, and it was very strong because the president of the university back then, Bernard Rentier, used to call it the stick and button. No stick and button. That would be nice. That wouldn't be nice, but stick and carrots model. And at the beginning, the researchers didn't like the fact that they were really obliged to deposit their publication in the institutional repository, and that any evaluation within the institution would be exclusively based on the repository. And there were incredible things, senior professors who didn't want to do it and who didn't receive any promotion, because if it was not in the repository, it didn't exist. You didn't publish anything. So this was very, very, very strict, and it was very strong to implement that. And I remember 8 years ago, many people, many researchers were really against that, not because of open access, but because it's linked to, to way to monitor the research, of course, at institutional level, but also, as I told you, for the evaluation. And then they had to engage in a lot of communication, trainings, explanation that anyway people are assessed, and it's better to have different indicators to assess them. It's better, as I tried to show, to allow them to put on the repository different kinds of research outputs, not only the articles, but also different types of publication and outputs. So but it needed a lot of explanations. And last year they conducted a survey, not published, but a survey in the university, and it appeared that I don't remember precisely the facts and figures, but it was more than 95% or even more people were now really happy with this policy within the university. But it took quite a long time. I would say it took 6 or 7 years to really have a change in the mentality. And now this mandate will serve as a model in French-speaking Belgium. We will have a decree next week, if everything goes well, for broadening the mandate to all institutions which receive public money for doing research.
Yes, you spoke about the decree of your regional parliament. Is it now adopted? No, it's still on work. Okay.
It's for next week.
Okay.
I think I have a question for Elizabeth. You talked about the researchers fearing for publishing and not be able to self-archive, or fearing of archiving and not be able to publish. The knowledge of everybody. Are there any published academics that have been sued by publishers for using the self-archiving? Has it gone public in terms of suing?
That's a really good question, and no, not that I'm aware of.
So what's the risk?
What's the risk, exactly? Yeah, I think there is... publishers are a lot more fearful about losing academics and support than academics perhaps believe that there is. Obviously, it depends on the academic. I've personally tried to negotiate with publishers for a more liberal copyright policy. I've had some movement, but I've not had kind of a complete carte blanche. Yes, you can have what you want. So I think the risk is just perceived. We're very risk averse, I think, as the academy. Generally.
My thinking as a non-academic, really, on that level, is that the worst case scenario, the publisher will cancel the agreement with you, then you go to another publisher who will take you on.
Yes, except for academics, so that they're seeking those top journals all the time. And so it's big business trying to get into those top journals. And once you've been accepted, you'll sign anything to get your paper accepted. And that's the truth of the matter. Certainly in countries like the UK, where there's got research assessment exercises which are very heavily based around your publications. So the ref is 60% public output based. And although technically they don't use journal metrics as part of that evaluation, it's meant to be peer review and peer review only. It's very hard to get a journal impact factor out of somebody's head.
A follow-up and a remark. The level of, let's say, legal knowledge among scholars is really, really low. And so apart from, but at the same time, for example, in physics, you would find copyrighted articles in archive. They have been there for a long time, and publisher never complain in any way. And they just say, okay, we just do it. So it's much more, let's say, cultural rather than individual. Once it has been done and done and done over again, then it's common practice. Otherwise, you would say, oh, we never know, and so on and so on. On the other side, the scholars who actually have legal knowledge, which is the law, who are the law scholars, live in a complete different world. they live in a world in which you're being paid for your articles, which is kind of the normal world we would expect. You have some work, you get paid for your work, and so on. So if you look at, for example, Real X as a group, you have LexisNexis. And LexisNexis is a complete different world in which the academic offers are treated completely different, and the academic, let's say, libraries and so on are completely different, treated differently too, because it's only like 1% of the market. So they get lower prices in order to access to the articles in which the authors have been paid, while here we're talking about 99% of public money in which you pay and you repay and you repay again. My remark was, so thanks for the 3 different talks in which the common point is really clear, is that the label open access is hiding like incredibly different policies, practices, access to journals, and let's say political economy. So I would like to build briefly on the third topic about your chess games. I think that you forget in your chess games 3 different actors that are really important, and we've seen that. The first one, let's say, the state, politicians, the politics level, and so on, which is really important. And if you've seen a British case, it's really interesting if you talk to JISC people right now, there are in fact 2 policies in Britain that fight each other and that fight also in the parliament. If you look at what has happened in different committees, and one policy is the one of let's say, universities, green roll, and so on, and the other one is a Finch policy. And they fight on the battle not within academia or publishers, but they fight it within the political arena in order to impose their view or exist more in some committees and, of course, in actual policies, which is, of course, exactly the case in the European Union. The other actors that are really there, and you mentioned it, is, let's say, social movements as a whole. They could be really powerful, for example, in biomedical world. Patients would say, okay, we want to have access to the papers that have been, published. Basically because it's our survivor, it's very important for us and our constituencies and so on. And the third actor, which is really, really, really powerful, both on the European Union level, the US level, and the UK level, is the industry. Not the publishing industry, but the rest of the world, who would say, oh, suddenly, yeah, let's make open access policy, TDM, and so on, so that my in-house researchers, let's say, in a pharma company, would completely have access to the data, and so paid, of course, by the public, with no barrier, no whatever complicated stuff in order to find them. So it costs me less money, and then I will have more money. And you would have alliances that are really, really strange between, let's say, the hippies of the open access movement and big companies that are outside of the publishing industries in order to impose this view of let's have open access for innovation. And of course, innovation would mean different things for, let's say, activists and for industries.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think I was rolling up governments in terms of research funders because they are ultimately funding research. So RCUK, HEFKI, they're funding either direct research projects or through what we call quality-related funding in the UK. The other actors, social movements, etc., absolutely, they are a reality and they exist and they influence policy, but they didn't appear in my game because they weren't policy makers as such. But you're right that they are there and they're very real, have a very real force.
Thank you very much again. I think we can break here for lunch, and we will resume at 2:30. Thank you. Please keep your little tags if you exit the